We've explored the idea of the unfortunate in the last couple of posts, looking at a personal story about direct giving with my friend Saidi, and a pie-in-the-sky idea about how we might better structure society and appreciate merit with effortocracy. But how do we go about really rethinking society? Well, we can't easily change our actions en masse if we keep the same assumptions about how things should work. We also can't deny realities about the way the world actually works. Thankfully though, there are many assumptions and intuitions about the realities of the world that we inherit in many ways. And many of these don't actually reflect reality, so this leaves space for a change in perspective that aligns with reality. The next couple of posts deal with counterintuitive realities, revealed through recent scientific findings. Saving lives reduces overpopulation. A counterintuitive win-win. When making the argument for charitable giving, a response I have often received is that saving lives in areas that are already overpopulated will perpetuate overpopulation, solving nothing. It's a concern I shared when I first considered charity. The logic seems sound on the face of it. For instance, if a predator is eliminated from, let's say, a rabbit habitat, the rabbits can become overpopulated until they reach some other natural limit, like resource depletion. This is the standard Malthusian theory of population equilibration. I will be making the case that the reverse situation is actually at play, and that, somewhat counterintuitively, by saving lives, we actually reduce overpopulation. I'll be employing two studies, one looking at data from the US and the other looking at data from Europe. The first conclusive finding is a clear positive correlation between the fertility rate and the infant mortality rate over time. The European study states, in every case, changes in infant mortality are positively associated with changes in fertility, and most are significant. This correlation is not just evident over time, but it's clear geographically. On the post, you can find a really great infographic that I've embedded from somewhere else. I didn't create this one, but it shows the correlation geographically and across time between the infant mortality rate and the fertility rate. It's very clear, the correlation. More infants dying means more babies being born, but correlation is not causation. It is entirely possible that any or all of the following relationships are at play. 1. A higher fertility rate causes a higher infant mortality rate. 2. A higher infant mortality rate causes a higher fertility rate. Or 3. Both fertility and infant mortality are affected by other variables. The case I am making depends on option 2 being a factor. A higher infant mortality rate causes a higher fertility rate. If this is the case, then saving lives reduces overpopulation, creating a win-win situation where the population becomes more sustainable alongside the obvious benefits to individuals whose lives are saved in the process. But why would this be? Let's unpack the issue. Why look at fertility? It's important to clarify that the fertility rate is not actually a measure of how fertile individuals are, but rather the average number of children an average woman gives birth to. It's essentially the birth rate, but relative to the female population only, which gives a clearer signal regarding reproductive behaviour. I'm actually going to use birth rate and fertility rate interchangeably here, as the data sources are mixed, and at times birth rate feels clearer, to me at least. And at any rate, they are very similar measures. And this is not a scientific paper. So we know there is a correlation between birth rate and infant mortality. But why is this? First, let's start with the obvious. 1. High birth rate causes high infant mortality. If we look at option 1, in the earlier list, it is understandable that there is a causal relationship where the more children someone has, the more likely a proportion of those children will die. It's easy to imagine that in a society where the norm was to have, say, 50 children each, many children would die due to exhausted resources and necessarily parental neglect, reaching a Malthusian equilibrium involving a lot of death. Families have a limited carrying capacity for children, and so greater birth rate will lead to greater infant mortality. But does carrying capacity explain the entire correlation? What about the fact that wealthier families tend to have less children? Surely if carrying capacity was the only issue, wealthier families would have more children due to a higher carrying capacity. This suggests that option 1 is not the only causal factor. 2. High infant mortality causes high birth rate. This is what I'm trying to argue for. The researchers in the US study, looking at the period between 1850 and 1940, found an indication of what they called hoarding. There is evidence that birth rates responded to changes in death rates by the late 19th century and early 20th century. Furthermore, the relationship strengthened over the early part of the 20th century as the decline in infant mortality proceeded rapidly. There is also a suggestion of a lagged response of fertility to mortality change, indicating hoarding or insurance behavior. So, the researchers found that following a reduction in infant mortality with some lag, the birth rate also reduced, not the other way around. So infant mortality reduced first and the birth rate second, suggesting that the reduction in infant mortality caused the reduction in the birth rate. Now, what is this hoarding they're talking about? Hoarding is the practice of having more children in an environment with a high risk of infant mortality to ensure that some children survive. But how do we know that hoarding is going on? Well, both studies use something called instrumental variable techniques to isolate the causal effect of child mortality on birth rate. I won't explain how these techniques work because I don't know how they work, but they do according to the consensus of professional researchers. And who am I to argue with the consensus of professional researchers? So this allows them to account for how much of the correlation is determined by other factors like hoarding. Now, it might be a little difficult to pass the information I'm about to deliver. It might be clearer if you read the post, but the broad numbers paint a pretty clear picture. If we look at the results from the US study, we find direct replacement effects are about 10 to 30%. Gross replacement effects, which include hoarding, are much higher, in the range of 60 to 80%. Direct replacement effects are what we should expect in a scenario where the causality is simply from birth rate to infant mortality. Gross replacement effects explain the additional births beyond what would be expected from direct replacement alone. It is likely these additional births are a response to high infant mortality, indicating parents are having extra children as a buffer against the loss of infants. Hoarding. Both studies agree that infant mortality has a causal effect on the birth rate. The US study says the few studies that attempted to disentangle the direction of causality using instrumental variables estimation found, as we did, that important causality was operating in both directions. The European study concluded there is substantial evidence that mortality decline was an important cause of fertility decline in Europe. So now let's move on to option 3, if you can remember other factors that affect both infant mortality and birth rates. There is always the possibility that other unknown factors might affect both infant mortality and birth rate. As the European study clarifies, we cannot completely rule out the possibility that the estimated associations of fertility and mortality actually reflect a spurious association induced by unobserved variables that influence both fertility and mortality and that change over time. In short, researchers can't rule out that what causes the correlated rise and fall of birth and death rates is dictated by some other independent factor like, say, breastfeeding, health conditions, nutrition, or unobserved aspects of economic development and modernization. While this is an important consideration that cannot be dismissed, it does not contradict the imperative to seek to save lives through charity. This is because not only do life-saving charities save lives, they do so by improving the very factors that might be involved in the correlation between birth rate and infant mortality. So, researchers have found that it is likely that a lowering of the infant mortality rate results in a lowering of the birth rate. Their conclusions come from data spanning continents and centuries. And when you look at the issue through a human lens, it makes sense too. In general, if there's a high chance children will die, people will have more children to mitigate the risk of losing all their children. Hoarding might not make a lot of sense to those of us who live in countries with very low infant mortality, but it shouldn't. I can only speak for myself, but my interests are more about quality of life rather than genetic survival. So the fact that I only have one kid is entirely predictable. If the researchers are correct that lowering of the infant mortality rate lowers the birth rate, then by contributing to saving lives, we are also helping stem overpopulation. And even if the researchers are incorrect and the correlation is caused by something else, we can still be confident that giving to charities that improve health measures, nutrition, women's education, and other important factors in order to save lives will also reduce overpopulation. So there's no trade-off to saving lives. It's a win-win. It results in positive experiences for at-risk individuals and their families, and also leads to a more sustainable level of population growth. So, there's no excuse. If you do give to charity or volunteer, I'd love to hear some of your experiences and what motivates you. Please visit the post linked in the description and join the discussion.